Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have a special guest, Rebecca Turbo. She's a certified public accountant and the founder of LearnNonprofitAccounting.com, and she will share with us today a little bit about reading your 990. A little bit about GLCYD. We are excited to bring you this webinar. We help the UP build model communities for youth through two different ways. We strengthen nonprofits by providing trainings, technical assistance, and consulting like this webinar, and then we promote asset-based youth development. So you may have heard of the 40 developmental assets. We'll be releasing new data on Marquette and Alger County coming up in a few weeks. Most of you on the line, I believe, are members of GLCYD, so I don't really have to go over the benefits. You've heard it many times, but we do have some great stuff going on for our members, so thank you to our members who are joining us on the webinar today. And now a little bit about Rebecca. Rebecca is a CPA and QuickBooks Online Pro Advisor with 25 years of varied accounting, auditing, and training experience. During the final years of her career, she spent 5 years as the Director of Finance with the NMU Foundation. She now helps nonprofits set up their accounting systems properly and teaches nonprofit accounting on her website, LearnNonprofitAccounting.com. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm so happy to be here. Is it my turn?
It sure is.
Well, great. Okay. So first of all, just a little disclaimer that this presentation is for information only and it's not meant to provide actual legal or tax advice. So please see your own tax advisor or tax attorney for specifics that are about your nonprofit situation. So before we get started into the details about reading the 990, I just thought I would talk a little bit about an overview of the 990. So there are like 5 types of 990 returns, and like the 990N and the 990EZ are generally for smaller nonprofits with less revenue that comes in each year than the ones that are required for the 990s. The 990PF is just for private foundations, so we're not talking about that today. The 990T is actually a tax form, and that one is for unrelated business income tax. So today we're just talking about the full form 990. It's a comprehensive 12-page form with schedules A through R. It's not necessarily a tax form. Really, it's not a tax form at all. It's actually an information return, and the IRS requires all nonprofits, with some exceptions, all nonprofits to file the 990 every year. And the exceptions are basically churches and some religious organizations. So, and the IRS wants the 990 to be filled out so they can determine that the nonprofit is tax compliant and that they're being accountable. So the 990 is not all about the numbers. It tells a story about the nonprofit, and it can be used as a great marketing tool. And remember, it's available to the public, and so there shouldn't be any personal social security numbers on it, but it should be available to the public for the last 3 years. So here are the 3 main points I wanted to cover today. 1 is about the story, 2 is about the financial health, and 3 are some red flags and other tips. So the story of the nonprofit can be found on the 990 in the mission, the programs, and the governance area. So I'll show you where those are located on the 990. And then, of course, there's the big part about the financial health of the organization. There's a lot of numbers on the 990 as well as a lot of written words. So we'll look at the written words and the numbers. The financial health will be the sort of the middle part of this presentation. And then at the end, I'll kind of review some things we went over and then cover some other things. So first of all, let's start with the story. And as we go through, I took just a sample from guidestar.org, so this is a pretty comprehensive 990. And I just took the sample, and I'm going to highlight a few areas as we go through these slides. So this is page 1 of the Form 990. And the first thing that I wanted to note is that the date at the top of the form, where it says 2014, I've highlighted it there. That is actually the date of the start of the fiscal year, so that is kind of confusing. In any other time I'm reporting something, I'm usually reporting at the end of the fiscal year. But this 2014 means their fiscal year started in the year 2014 and ended in the year 2015, and that can be kind of confusing. So if you're wondering, what year you're looking at, just be aware that that's the start of their fiscal period. So the page 1 includes information like the mission statement and the total U.S. employees. So these would be employees that, even if the nonprofit has overseas offices, the U.S. employees are only listed on the 990. Total volunteers, and if there's any unrelated business income, that goes on 7B here, you can see on this form. Unrelated business income is taxable, and we will talk about that a little bit later here, but that would also require Form 990T, which I just mentioned in the overview. And unrelated business income, there's a lot more discussion that can be had about it, but it's basically income that comes in that's not related to the mission of the nonprofit, even though it can be used for the mission, but the revenue is not related from the mission. So under program services, so this is page 2 of the Form 990, and it's part 3. This is where you can find what are the main programs of the nonprofit. What are the 3 largest programs? So this is a great place for the marketing part of the nonprofit. Like, who's going to be reading the 990? Usually they're people like possible large donors or grant organizations, or maybe even potential board members, and of course the media loves to read the 990. So this is a great place to show off, what programs that the nonprofit is doing and how those programs are accomplishing its mission. So here again, you'll find there's a mission statement, and then the programs hopefully are accomplishing that mission. So here you can see the total revenue, if any of these programs bring in revenue, and then also the total grants that each program brings in. Now, if there's more programs that are core programs to the organization, Schedule O is a really, really important part, and we will look at that on the next slide. But at the top of each part, you'll notice it says check if Schedule O contains a response or a note. So Schedule O is like an additional part of the 990 that will allow you extra space to talk about more if you can't fit it all in the original form. So here's what the supplemental Schedule O looks like, and this is actually only the first part. This particular 990 had 10 pages of supplemental information. So it's very important to go read the Schedule O and see what might be on there. And also, Schedule O is a required part of the 990. Even if there's nothing on it, it's a required part to be filed. So moving on to governance. This is part 6 of the 990, page 6, and this is the governance management disclosure. And on this page, there are some questions concerning business relationships or family relationships among officers, directors, trustees, and key employees. And that is very important to disclose because, in any kind of business or organization, if there are conflicts of interest, it can lead to some transactions that maybe don't happen at arm's length. So it's important to try to keep that kind of stuff out of the nonprofit organization. Also, are there any significant changes to the governing documents? Are there any significant diversions of assets? And this is question number 5 here. Has there been any thefts, embezzlements, or other unauthorized use of assets during the year? That's an important question to check out. And of course, are there any written meeting notes and committee notes, which is required, to have a corporation? So that obviously should be yes. And section B of this governance part is all about the policies. Now, these aren't policies that the IRS requires, but these are best practice policies like conflict of interest, document retention and destruction, the whistleblower policy, and what processes used to determine compensation. So as long as these policies have been adopted by the board, the questions can be answered yes. And if the questions on your nonprofit's 990 are answered no, you may want to look into getting those kind of policies in place. So here is what the Form 990 instructions say concerning the policies questions. Quote, the IRS considers such policies and procedures to generally improve tax compliance. The absence of appropriate policies and procedures can lead to opportunities for excess benefit transactions, inurement, operations for non-exempt purposes, or other activities inconsistent with exempt status. And inurement just means somebody is getting personal benefit from the nonprofit, and that's obviously a no-no, and you wouldn't be able to keep your nonprofit status or your tax-exempt status if there are those kind of things happening. So let's move on to financial health. And I have broken this down into parts because, well, there's a lot to list, and I didn't want to overwhelm the slides here. So I'll go through it in several parts. First of all, we'll look at the statement of revenue, and we'll look at where we can find out where the sources of revenue are, if revenue is more or less than expenses. And having revenue more than expenses is really good. That means you can have reserves, or you can add to your reserves, and reserves are like a long-term savings or rainy day savings. It's really good for nonprofits to keep reserves. If expenses are more than revenue, then why is that? So first of all, the statement of revenue is shown in Part 8, and this is the detailed statement of revenue. And this is where, you know, it's nice, like this nonprofit has more than one source of revenue. They have fundraising events, they have some campaigns, they have contributions from donors, or maybe some grants in there, and some non-cash contributions. And this also on the statement of revenue, on this part, you'll see the unrelated business income, which we talked about earlier. This, whoops, sorry, skip that one. Okay, so this is the other part of the statement of revenue, and this is just all the other revenue besides those main ones we looked at before. And I just highlighted this here because this is where you're going to put the fundraising. You're going to see the fundraising events. They had a net loss from fundraising events according to their 990, but really if you look at the real numbers, you have to report the gross income from fundraising, not including the amount that was contributions, because the contributions were listed above. We looked at that line before. So, so sometimes this can be a little bit maybe confusing, but really they didn't have a loss from fundraisers. They just had some contributions included in the revenue that came in. Okay, and then this is actually the second part of the first page. We looked at the first page on one of the original slides, but that was talking more about the general information on the 990. So this is actually a summary of the revenues and expenses and net assets. So here's where you can look what the total revenues were, you know, this year versus last. You can also see if the revenues were more or less than expenses, and in this case the revenues were more than expenses, which is good. And it looks like in the current year the surplus revenue is actually about half of what the surplus was last year. So that's interesting, and you'd wonder what the 3 or 5 year trend was if you looked at, you know, the previous 990s. Also, you can see the net assets or fund balance at the bottom, and it's also good to know, are the net assets increasing or are they decreasing? In this case, they're increasing. That always feels good to know that the net assets are increasing, because for the future of the nonprofit. So here's our financial health part 2. And in this part, I'm going to talk about program expenses and other expenses. Let's look where those are. And then I want to talk briefly about the overhead, which is operating expenses of the nonprofit. So here is part 9, which is the statement of functional expenses. And this one will list all the expenses in detail, but it will also list them out by whether they are program service expenses, management and general expenses, or fundraising expenses. This is required to be filled out by every nonprofit. So and down here is where you can find those other expenses I was talking about. So these other expenses should all be explained on Schedule O. So I just noted that this other expenses here is 10.6% of their total expenses. And I did look on Schedule O, and they had explained in more detail what those expenses were. So these other expenses just they don't fit in categories that are already listed. And that's all that means. And now here's how to calculate the overhead. So we're going to look at the total at the bottom of functional expenses on line 25, I believe that is. I cut that off. So we're going to look at the total and we're going to calculate a ratio or a rate of overhead. So in order to get that, we're going to add the management in general plus the fundraising, and we're going to divide it by the total expenses. And in this case, I did the calculation over here. And in this nonprofit, 25% of their expenses were spent on operating or overhead, and the other 75% were spent on program. And one thing I just want to mention is overhead is a required part of doing business. It's operating expenses, it's salaries and rent and all those office expenses and travel, fundraising. That is required in order to run the programs of the nonprofit. So sometimes when you hear stories in the news about the overhead rate, you wonder. It really kind of depends on the organization as to how they calculate the overhead rate or the operating or fundraising, how they calculate the fundraising. There's, a procedure. And at the foundation I was at the end of the year, we actually did some allocation to the fundraising, and we had a way to do that every year. So each nonprofit's going to be different. So I would say that, the percentage isn't really, the big thing, but if you hear people talking about the overhead percentage, that's what they're talking about right there. So I just wanted to briefly cover that. So this is the financial health part 3. And this part, I'm going to show you how the 990 reconciles to financial statements. And a place where you can look, are the net assets increasing or decreasing? Actually, we looked at one spot already. What level of unrestricted assets are available? And there's a place where you can actually list all the endowment details over the last 5 years. So we'll look briefly at that. And then if you want to compare with other 990s, it would be good to find organizations that have similar missions and particularly are more around the same size. So if you want to compare, revenues or expenses or overhead rates. So let's look at this part, which is the reconciliation to the financial statements. And this is part 11. And the highlighted part that I've circled here, these are things that are listed on the financial statements, but they are not listed on the 990. So that's why this is the reconciliation between the financials and the 990. So there are no net unrealized gains or losses of investments on the 990. There's no donated services or use of facilities on the 990. There's no investment expenses or prior period adjustments. So these bottom two are other like accounting adjustments. But none of these things are included on the 990, although they are included on the financials. And that's where you can see how does the financial statement agree to the 990. And now we'll look at the balance sheet, which is really a listing of the assets and the liabilities and the net assets or fund balance. And this is on part 10. And I didn't show the whole thing here. It's pretty long, so I skipped the liabilities. But there would be another section here with the liabilities. But really I wanted to look at the net assets section at the bottom, which is where you can find that unrestricted net assets number that I was telling you about earlier. And over here you can see that the unrestricted net assets are pretty healthy in this organization. And unrestricted net assets are things that the nonprofit can use these cash or investments in any way that they deem appropriate to accomplish their mission, or for the operating expenses or whatever it takes to accomplish the mission. So it's important to have unrestricted net assets. I would be worried if those were almost zero or going down rapidly every year. These temporarily and permanently restricted net assets would be donations from they could be donations from donors. For instance, at the foundation, they were donations for scholarships or for special programs for the university. So those were definitely monies that we could only spend in a certain way, and that's why they were temporarily or permanently restricted. And then, of course, here's another part where you will see the total net assets, which also carries over to the front page, which we looked at, the summary page. And you can see last year versus this year. Now, this is in the supplemental schedules, and I forgot to put what schedule this is, but anyways, it's part 5 of this particular supplemental schedule. So this is where the endowment funds detail is, and notice it's over a 5-year period, which is awesome. So you can see that in this particular nonprofit, the endowment has been growing pretty steadily over the past 4 years, and then it did dip, right? But if you look up here, there was a loss in investment earnings, gains, and losses, and that's usually the culprit in why an endowment decreases. It is totally based on the market usually. So, but it's good to see that they're pretty level and growing mostly over the year. And let's see. So we'll move on to the last section, which is red flags and other tips. So, and here I'm going to show you some compensation information, which a lot of media seems to be really interested in. I see stories now and then about that. And also in the compensation information section, you have to make sure to list all officers, directors, and trustees that served at any portion of the year. And you report them even if they're unpaid volunteers. And then, is there any unrelated business income? Again, that needs to be, I'm just kind of reviewing some things now here, but make sure if there is unrelated business income that you properly fill out the 990T. And then remember, what is in other income? That should be properly described in section or Schedule O. 990s are submitted under penalties of perjury, so make sure that the information you're providing for your tax preparer is the proper information. And the 990 is a public document. You need to keep it for 3 years. You should keep a file for 3 years going back, so if anybody wants to see it, except for Schedule B, which I'm not covering Schedule B in this part, but Schedule B talks or shows the largest donors who meet a certain threshold. It shows their names and their addresses. That is not public information. The board is legally fiduciarily responsible, so the board should be reviewing the 990 before it goes out. And then remember to check the governance area and make sure that, do you have the proper policies in place, or does the nonprofit have the proper policies in place? And, reading through the programs, do they support the mission? Because the purpose and mission is what the nonprofit filed for tax exempt status with the IRS. So you need to make sure that the programs are supporting the mission. So here's the first place where there is salary reporting, and this is on the 990 Part 7. And generally this is anyone making over $100,000 in reportable income on W-2 Box 1 gets listed here. They're generally key employees. And then also you need to list all the officers, directors, trustees, and usually they're not making any salaries, but you still need to list them here. And then this is the other part where there's salary reporting. This is more detailed, and this is just the employees, and this is Schedule J. Now it should reconcile with Part 7. And the third part of salary reporting is really independent contractors, and this is Section B of Schedule J. So these independent contractors, you have to report the top 5 independent contractors that were paid over $100,000 during the year. Even if they weren't sent in 1099, not all independent contractors are sent to 1099 via the 1099 rules. So it doesn't matter if you gave them a 1099 or not, they need to be listed here. Last comments. So the preparer of the 990 is only responsible for preparing it in accordance with the information that is given to them by the organization. So if you have an outside preparer, yes, they are responsible in certain ways, but they can really only rely on the information that you give them. So make sure a nonprofit's giving the proper information. Make sure the staff and the board members review the 990. They know kind of what to look for before it goes to the IRS. And if you're on the board and you get a funny feeling about something while you're reading something on the 990, make sure to ask about it, because you want to make sure that it's filled out properly, and it's worth it to understand. It's worth it to understand the 990 and what's being reported there. You can also ask your auditor or your tax preparer if the 990 seems in line with what they see in other nonprofits that are in maybe your similar mission or your similar industry, and what do they know about your financials, and how does the 990 compare to those? So usually the auditing firm is also doing the 990, but ask those questions, to see how yours compares. That would be an interesting discussion. And I guess that's my last slide, but before I go, I just want to tell you that I have actually put together a checklist based upon this presentation. And if you go to this link, you can get an access to that checklist. And if you click this link, it's not going to get you anywhere. You have to actually go to the link here. So also, if you have any more questions, you can reach me. My email is rebecca@nonprofittrainer.com. That's the best way to reach me. Also, I have a Facebook page. You can go there, check that out, or reach me on there if you want to comment. I have a website and blog. We already talked about learnnonprofitaccounting.com, and there's the link to download the free checklist. And I think I just finished in the nick of time, Victoria.
You sure did. We did record today's session, so if you watched it and you loved it and you want to share it with your board or with other people on your staff, I'll send a follow-up email as soon as I get it up on YouTube with the link, and I will also include the link to the free checklist that Rebecca has put together for you. So you get the YouTube link, the checklist link, and you'll also get an evaluation survey from me because we love evaluation here at GLCYD. So you can take the evaluation survey as well. Besides that, you have
That's
anything
it.
else? That's it.
No, I
Awesome.
just wanted to, since we didn't have time for questions, just please email me with questions. I'd really appreciate that.
And I'll make sure to get your email in the email that goes out to everyone as well. So if you didn't get a chance to write it down, it'll be in the follow up email that I send probably later tomorrow morning. You'll get it.
All right. Sounds
Awesome.
great.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for
Thanks.
attending.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day. Bye.